This is lecture number 9, the Federalist Era between 1789 to 1801, end of the 1700s, what we would also call turn of the century. This would be America, especially politically, right after the Constitution is ratified. What kind of government now will our Constitution create for America? We're going to use the Electoral College to elect our first president. Unanimously voted President of the United States in 1789 was George Washington. Now, George Washington, as president, never had any political affiliation, but you could argue, and he's going to serve 2 terms, that he would side with one political ideology over another, which we'll get into. Now, Washington did something that was not in the Constitution. He realized that this was a major responsibility, the executive branch, and he wanted help. So George Washington would create the first cabinet, which was basically a group of advisors in certain aspects of politics. The ones that he would create, an attorney general, which is someone that would prosecute criminals or crimes. He would create a Secretary of War. The first Secretary of War would be one Henry Knox. But the other 2 cabinet positions, and these 2 are very important to the beginning of American politics under the Constitution, he would appoint as Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. The Secretary of State traditionally is someone that works it helps the president, especially in foreign affairs. He would appoint as the Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, whose job would be especially important because of all the financial problems America was going through at the end of the 1700s. Under Washington's presidency, Congress would pass the Judiciary Act of 1789, which would, for the first time, create the federal court system. This would create the Supreme Court. Now, Hamilton and Jefferson, in the beginning of American politics under the Constitution, they would become political rivals. They would have different ideologies. Their beliefs would lead to the first 2 political parties in American history. Alexander Hamilton had the very difficult challenge of improving the American economy, which was really going through a recession. We talked about all the problems that had happened, the debt that we had, the expenses of a new government, how our trade was interrupted, and so forth. So it would be really important that Hamilton get it right. The goals of Hamilton's financial plan, again, this would be the foundation of the American economy. His goals were rooted in, he wanted to get Americans to trust the American Treasury, but he especially wanted the wealthy to turn around and invest in America. That was probably his biggest goal, to get the wealthy to invest back in America, because we had wealthy landowners and merchants up and down the states. More specifically, there was 5 elements to his financial plan, 5 goals to bring us a strong economy. The first one had to deal with bonds. During the American Revolution, like all wars, the government sold war bonds, which are loans to individuals. You pay some money for this war bond, and the government promises to pay you back at a later date with interest. This is how bonds work. Now, many Americans believed with our financial issues that the war bonds were now worthless, that the government in our bad economic crisis would not honor the war bonds. Well, Hamilton believed that the government should, but he also believed there wasn't enough money to pay people interest. So his goal was to fund those bonds at par. And that means to pay the value of the war bonds, not the interest. Again, this was an attempt to get people to trust the government, to trust the Treasury Department. So this idea of funding at par war bonds, that was one element of Hamilton's financial plan. The second element, which was controversial, and a number of these are going to be controversial, it's hard to make all of these states happy, was the assumption of state debts. Most of the states owed money to banks, either in America or in England. And Hamilton wanted to, at least one time, that the federal government take on all of the state's debts. And what made that controversial is that some states had high debts and some states had no debts. And they didn't want to be, states with no debts didn't want to be responsible for helping to pay off the debts of others. But again, Hamilton wanted to kind of bring in all the states, almost get them to owe the federal government, bring them under one umbrella. The third element of his financial plan was to pass tariffs. A tariff is a tax on goods that come into the country, or customs duties is another way of describing tariffs. And there's two reasons for tariffs. We can make money when we tax goods that come in from other countries, what we would call imports. And also tariffs could help Americans to buy more American goods. The fourth part of Hamilton's financial plan was to pass an excise tax. And an excise tax is usually on a product made in America that's more of a luxury, that's not a necessity. And the plan was to pass an excise tax on whiskey, because whiskey was one of those products made through the countrysides of colonies, and felt they could make a tax on this. This is one way they could raise money. Now, the fifth part of his financial plan, and without a doubt the most controversial, was the creation of a national bank. Really one roof, one organization that would take in revenue, take in money, invest money, and so forth. And we'll talk about how the national bank is really going to divide American leaders. So this was Hamilton's financial plan that had to get passed by Congress. And for the most part, it did. Now, the National Bank brought up this particular debate. Some American leaders said, the National Bank, there's nothing about this in the Constitution. There's nothing that gives any branch of government the power to make a national bank. This belief that our government should only do what's in the Constitution specifically, that's called strict construction or strict interpretation. Again, the belief that government can only do what's specifically said in the Constitution. What Hamilton was doing, and what others agreed with him, was the idea of loose construction, which is a loose interpretation of the Constitution, or using the elastic clause, right? The elastic clause. Congress especially can do what's necessary and proper for the good of the people. It doesn't have to specifically be in the Constitution. So this was a debate amongst political leaders in America. Now, an interesting development took place in 1794. It was a challenge to our new federal government. When the government imposed the whiskey taxes, there was a rebellion to challenge the government's right to do so. A rebellion in Pennsylvania, particularly people that were making whiskey, rebelled against the tax, and the federal government came and squashed it. And there wasn't a big backlash to it, because now we had a constitution, that allowed the government to make the laws and enforce the laws. So it was a test to the new federal government, and the federal government passed. So soon into Washington's presidency, we're going to have the birth of the party system, the first two political parties in American history. This is going to take place between 1792 and 1793. And really, the reason behind the birth of the party system, we're going to have two different philosophies, political leaders, but the biggest reason that led to the birth of the party system was the debate over the national bank. That's really important for you to remember. The debate of the national bank led to the birth of the first party system in America, as well as other philosophies, as we'll see. The Federalists were those that supported Alexander Hamilton. The Federalist was Hamilton's party. The Federalists were on one side, Alexander Hamilton's party, and on the other side, led by Thomas Jefferson, would be called the Democratic Republicans. And over time, they would drop, the Democratic title and just be called the Republicans. Although it's not similar to today's Republican Party, it would be different at that time in history. So I like to refer to them as the Democratic Republicans. And again, they're going to have differences, as you can see over here to the right. And the terms over here on the left really describe their differences. When it comes to economic policy, the Federalists were pro-business, industry. We talked about how Hamilton really wanted to invest in the merchants and business, etc., to make America stronger, wealthier. When it comes to the Democratic Republicans, they were all about agriculture. They were all about growing food and every family being able to control their own farm. They really wanted the federal government to protect and help agriculture to grow. Of course, the issue that maybe set all this into place, the big divisive issue, was the national bank. The Federalists, because it was led by Alexander Hamilton, were pro-national bank. The Democratic Republicans were against the national bank. They thought that gave too much economic power to one organization. So that means, again, that the Federalists, again, were for loose construction of the Constitution. And the Democratic Republicans were for strict construction of the Constitution. That was a big debate. I talked about differences in industry and agriculture. And now when it comes to politics, the Federalists were more about the elites, the wealthy white males participating in politics and voting and being elected into parties. The Democratic Republicans were more for the common man, as long as he was educated. More inclusive. Now, don't get me wrong, no one was talking about women or people of color, or even poor whites to some degree. But the Federalists were definitely more for the elite, powerful white males, and the Republicans a little bit more into the middle class participation as well. The Federalists were all about federal power, okay? The executive branch, Congress, etc. While the Democratic Republicans were more for state power. Okay, the federal government should not interfere with states' rights to make laws. When it came to foreign affairs, Hamilton and the Federalists wanted to go back and make a strong alliances with Great Britain. They felt economically that would help us, especially in manufacturing and trade. The Democratic Republicans, however, were more for an alliance with France and honoring the Franco-American alliance since the American Revolution. So these are the philosophies of the first two political parties in American history. And when it comes to George Washington, where did he stand? Washington tried to avoid this political fight. He would not declare himself a member of either party. However, you can definitely say his policies, his decisions sided with the Federalists. And that's why when we talk about the Federalist era, Washington's presidency goes underneath that. Even though he didn't call himself a Federalist, his policies, his decisions sided with the Federalists. Now, after Washington, of course, John Adams would become president, and you're going to see common practices or philosophies. First of all, when it came to foreign policy under the Federalists, there were conflicts taking place around the world, and some close to America. And the policy of the Federalists, as we look over here to the right, neutrality. The policy of the Federalists, we cannot get involved. We're too young of a country. We don't have a strong military or economy yet to get involved, take an active role in foreign policy. An example of that, under Washington, Congress passed the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. And by the way, when we talk about Congress, at this time, during Washington's presidency, the majority of the members of Congress were Federalists. The Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 was a result of the French Revolution, something you should have learned about, how France not only was going through a revolution, but they were at war with other surrounding nations and so forth. And the French wanted American assistance in fighting against their enemies. But Washington and the American Congress, mostly of Federalists, decided to stay out. So America passed the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 to stay out of the French Revolution, which would anger the Democratic Republicans in America and, of course, the French themselves. In the middle of this whole French Revolution and these wars taking place, America would become a victim. We'd kind of get caught in the middle. And not to mention, the British were still harassing us on our borders and in the open seas. Well, Washington got, actually, he would be our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, to create a treaty with England in 1794. A temporary type of peace, a temporary agreement with England to stop harassing Americans, to stop the British from attacking Americans on the open seas, especially this practice of impressment. This was a practice where the British would attack an American ship, not only steal the goods, but force the American citizens to join their military, to join their navy. That's impressment. Okay, the British were using this against the Americans, attacking our ships and kidnapping the American sailors and turning them into British soldiers. And again, this would be a temporary peace because we're going to continue to be harassed by the British up until the War of 1812. Another example of Washington and the Federalists staying out of conflict, the Pinckney Treaty of 1795. And this was in response to the Spanish also harassing America along the Mississippi River. Spain was losing some of its power at the time, but they still had colonies, especially in Florida, in North America. So this again was another example of a treaty to avoid war. In this case, it was with Spain. So we see this over and over again, the Federalists under Washington avoiding war, trying to remain neutral. As a matter of fact, when Washington gave his farewell address speech in 1797, he gave this speech with a warning to stay out of foreign alliances, because they would drag us into conflict and war that we didn't need. And you can see that with a quote under here. History and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. Washington served 2 terms, and as the next election came along, the election of 1796, now we're fully going to see the 2 political parties involved in this presidential election. His vice president would now run for president of the United States as a Federalist. His name was John Adams. He would run against Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. John Adams would win the presidency, a true Federalist president. And what we're going to see with John Adams, this continued neutrality, staying out of conflict. An example of that was the French were also harassing America during the French Revolution. Again, attacking and raiding our ships in the open seas. And Adams tried to work out an agreement. And an agreement, just in trying to work out the agreement, turned out to somewhat of a scandal, a test to John Adams. It was called the XYZ Affair in 1797, and this cartoon to the right kind of explains it. Adams sent diplomats to France to work with the French government to try to stop the conflicts in the open seas. And secret agents approached the American diplomats and demanded a bribe of $10 million. This whole approach that a bribe was an insult, a total sign of disrespect by the French government to America. So the result of that, we didn't pay the bribe. Our diplomats came back, and really, we fought the French back. We fought them back on the open oceans. It was called, but it was unofficial. Okay, it wasn't an official war. That's why this period, the result of the XYZ affair, we were involved in a quasi-war, which means unofficial war against France between 1798 and 1800. So again, Adams wants neutrality. He wants peace. But in this case, we were fighting back. We were going to stand up for ourselves because we always did. The French were kind of busy in their revolution, and eventually they came around and negotiated with America. It's probably Adams' finest moment. He negotiated a peace with France in 1800. It was called the Convention of 1800. And this is really going to lead to, the French really no longer being a threat to America. Adams' greatest accomplishment, the Convention of 1800, a peace agreement with France. So the Federalists, as we're looking at them, the economic policies are working. We'll talk about that a little bit. They're keeping us out of war. But they're involved in this competition for political power with Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. And unfortunately, what happens when one group is in power for some time is that they will abuse that power. And this is unfortunately also a legacy of the Federalists. They passed 2 laws in 1798 that would be an abuse of power. The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed in 1798. Examples of the Federalists abusing their power. The Alien Act, which doesn't sound like abuse of power, it put sudden strict restrictions on immigrants to America, on how they were to become citizens and thus vote. It put these sudden restrictions on immigrants to America. But it was obvious to everyone the purpose of the Alien Act, because immigrants tended to become Democratic Republicans. It was obvious to everyone that they passed the Alien Act to try to weaken the Democratic Republican Party. Now, the Sedition Act was a more obvious violation of the First Amendment. Sedition means a term almost like treasonous, going against your government. The Sedition Act really gave the federal government to arrest anyone that criticized the government. And in this case, the government, was dominated by the Federalists. The Sedition Act was an attempt to quiet the Democratic Republicans, an obvious violation of First Amendment. Well, as Americans do, they're going to resist, especially the Democratic Republicans. Two states, Virginia and Kentucky, in which the majority of their political leaders were Democratic Republicans, they put together a written protest, the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, created in 1798, okay, a written protest to the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. These state governments, in their protest, said that these acts were unconstitutional and that they would refuse to recognize them. They would refuse to honor them. This is called nullification, like to dishonor, to void, to not recognize. So we see this internal political division taking place in America because of the abuse of power by the Federalists. We see the quote here by Thomas Jefferson. We see early political cartoon, how the Sedition Act was challenging some of our basic freedoms. The beauty of American government, though, is that when we see abuse of power and we want change, the way to do it, and history has told us that, you do it at the voting booth. The election of 1800 saw John Adams running again for a second term against Thomas Jefferson. American opinion changed, especially because of Alien and Sedition Act. American opinion changed, and Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans won the presidency. And this is why this moment in history, this election of 1800, is also called the Revolution of 1800. It's called a revolution because for the first time in American history, we changed a political ideology. We went from one political party to another. And of course, everyone was holding their breath. Is there going to be drastic change? Or are the Federalists going to go quietly? Will this work the way the Constitution intended to? And we'll talk more about how that went in the next lecture. But Jefferson defeated Adams. Now, when we look at the Federalist legacy, because they're no longer going to have a president again after this defeat, they're still going to be active in politics, especially in the courts. When we look at their legacy, you can argue good and bad, democratic and undemocratic. I think right away when you look at their legacy, this symbol down here represents, what history tells us, their economic policy worked out really well at that time in history. It got us out of the recession. It set us up for economic prosperity. So Hamilton's economic policies were a success. I guess you can say another positive part of the Federalist legacy, they kept us out of war, right? They kept us out of conflicts with Spain and England and France. The Neutrality Proclamation, the Pinckney Treaty, the Convention of 1800 kept us out of war when we were not ready for war. But at the same time, you can argue that the Federalists, because of the threat of the Democratic Republicans, they abused their power with the Alien and Sedition Acts. But in the election of 1800, it was an early test to our democracy, and American leaders and so forth, they passed that test. Americans were unhappy with their government, so they voted in not only a president with a different political party, but now the Democratic Republicans would be the majority in Congress as well, but still with many challenges. So when we look at the themes of this lecture, analyze factors that led to the creation of the two-party system during the 1790s. What caused us to turn to two political parties instead of one? 2, evaluate the relative importance of domestic issues and foreign issues in politics during the Federalist era. So, you're analyzing the Federalists and how they handled things at home and how they handled things with other countries. And the third one, be familiar with the two political parties. What did they believe in? And how this led to their decisions.